Natalie Thurston. I'm with Accelerate Health. I'm Program Director with the NIGMS grant, and I'm here today to talk to you about healthcare reimbursement. So we're going to cover four main topics today. What is healthcare reimbursement? Who are the payers? When should I start thinking about reimbursement? And what do I need to think about when commercializing? So first, what is healthcare reimbursement? Healthcare reimbursement describes the payment that a hospital, doctor, facility, anyone receives after giving or providing a medical service, as well as anything involved with the reimbursement. So where healthcare reimbursement is different than your standard transaction with, let's say, a grocery store is, just because you provide the service doesn't mean you're going to receive payment for the service. There are many steps involved in that process, many hurdles that need to be jumped. Some of those including submitting the right code. Are you contracted? Are you credentialed? Are you doing the right process to make sure that you're setting yourself up for the highest payment possible? So again, reimbursement is dependent on many factors. Let's say you have a certain list price. Your list price is not a guarantee that you will receive that payment of the list price. So for example, if you're billing $4,000, you shouldn't necessarily expect to receive $4,000 from your payer. If there's a contract involved, that may lower the rate. If you're out of network with the provider, that may lower the rate. If you're billing with an unlisted code, you may receive an amount set by the insurance payer. That's different than what you bill as a list price. Again, there's multiple factors that play into what you'll actually receive as payment from an insurance company. One key thing that I tell everybody when I talk about healthcare reimbursement is there is no guarantee of payment. Just because you provide a service does not mean you will be paid. Just because you provide a service doesn't mean you'll receive full payment, does not mean you will receive partial payment. It does not mean you will receive any payment. And just because you have regulatory clearance or regulatory approval, FDA approval, does not mean you will get paid by insurance. One of the best examples I give is when CareDx launched AlloMap commercially in 2006, they received FDA approval in 2008. They did not start receiving payment from a lot of payers outside of Medicare until 2010 when they were incorporated into the guidelines. So again, this is not a quick process. There's no guarantee. And sometimes you're happy with what you receive. So just a background of health insurance in the U.S. Currently, 91.5% of the U.S. has insurance. You can see the breakdown here. Most of it is by private plans. 17.9% is by Medicare. 17.9% is by Medicaid. It's very small is VA in the Civilian Health Medical Program of the Department of the VA. And then 8.5% is uninsured. Where this is misleading is while 67.3% is covered by private plans and 17.9% by Medicare, a lot of those private plans cover what's called Medicare Advantage, where they are acting as the Medicare plan for the member or the patient when you're talking to clinicians. And so that number is probably a little bit lower with Medicare Advantage, and Medicare is really a little bit higher. The reason that's important is when you go to start commercializing your product, when you start billing and wanting to receive payment, there should be a strategy involved with your health plans. How do I approach this? Because if you try and say, I want to bill everyone and appeal everyone, you'll be overwhelmed. So typically what happens in this space is the model is, well, once I get Medicare coverage, then I'm going to approach Medicare Advantage, and then I'm going to approach based on where my sales volume is and so forth. So you do want to know what your payer mix is early on in this process so you can know how to strategize what to do and utilize your resources most effectively. So again, looking at the top 5 commercial health plans, they're the obvious ones: United, Anthem, Aetna, Cigna, and Humana. What's important to know about this is each health plan has their own personality. United is so huge. They are a huge elephant to tackle. They have several subsets underneath them, whether it's Oxford, Optum. There's a lot of subsidiaries underneath that United Healthcare group. And so it makes it really challenging. With that being said, United and Humana are mainly Medicare Advantage. So again, just things to strategize when you look at the payers and know what's going on. You can start saying, okay, I'm going to tackle these certain payers because I have this coverage. I'm in these states. And it helps with really starting to tackle that elephant of reimbursement. So the payers, just to give a brief explanation of payers in this relationship. So patients, health insurance protects patients from the high cost of medical care. Payers, paid by employees or CMS to manage or administer the benefits, and then the insurance companies have many processes involved. I'll be honest, there are some days where I think the health insurance companies put processes in so that they don't have to pay. Such as HMOs having referrals. Well, if you have to get a referral, how many of you just say, oh, I don't even want to bother going because I have to get that referral? Again, there's steps involved because their job is to make revenue for their shareholders. And how do you do that? You decrease the amount of payments you make out. So just know, again, the takeaway here is there's a lot of steps involved. It's not just submitting a claim and the claim gets paid. The other thing about payers, and this is just one example coming out of CMS, this is the OIG report, Medicare Advantage Appeal Outcomes and Audit Findings raises concerns about service and payment denials. There's this perception that if I pay, they pay correctly, and that's actually not the case. In this report, and it is from the Office of Inspector General, CMS cited 56% of audited Medicare Advantage organization contracts for making inappropriate denials. So this is CMS, this is the government health plan. They're making mistakes. The takeaway from there is that commercial plans are going to take mistakes. Medicaid plans are going to make mistakes. So even if you do everything right, you submit it correctly, you have the right codes, you have the right MPI number, you have everything correct on your 1500 form, there's still a chance of the payment being incorrect or there being no payment and that's incorrect. The bottom statistic on this, and you know, we don't have time to talk a lot about appeals today, but that 1% of MAO beneficiaries utilize the appeal process. We can have a whole nother session on appeals and the importance of this. The takeaway is not very many people actually utilize that process, and they should, because you can get a lot of overturns through the appeal process, but we'll speak to that more later. So reimbursement. Start thinking about reimbursement as soon as possible. It should not be the afterthought, which is unfortunately what happens a lot of times. If you start thinking about reimbursement when you're developing your product, your end result may be different. How you ship your box through UPS to get to the lab and the processing. If you think about reimbursement from the beginning, that whole workflow may change. And so the questions you need to ask during that development phase is, what is the clinical value and what is the economic value? Because those are going to be the questions that are asked all throughout the process and at the end with the insurance company. Are you better than standard of care? How does it compare to current treatment options? And what is the cost? So for example, I'll use AlloMap again as an example. AlloMap, the charge price was $3,600. Well, how does AlloMap, a heart transplant test that monitors for rejection, compare to the cost of heart biopsy? Well, biopsy is about $4,000. So what is that economic value there? Could it be set up different? You know, part of the reason that it took so long to get coverage for that particular product was because clinicians were receiving payment from biopsy and AlloMap was taking that payment away. So again, lots of things to think about in the development phase that can help impact your product and reimbursement at the end. So think about it early. When you're developing your product, you want to evaluate your competitors. Is there anything else out there like what you have? So currently there's a company called Strata Oncology in Michigan. They're trying to model like Foundation Medicine, for example. They have a similar test, different number of genes, but it is something to look at. What codes do they use? What coverage do they have? Is there an LCD in place or an NCD with Medicare? What's their list price? Do you charge similar? Do you charge more? Do you charge less? Key thing, what studies do you have to support your technology? Keep in mind, when you're on the payer side, you can always say, I need more studies. that is a standard question in their technology assessment departments, the areas that review the technology. What studies do you have out there? Are they paid for by the company itself? Who funded the studies? Are there any legal requirements to cover or not cover this type of technology? If you look at Cologuard, they had an advantage where the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, USPSTF, said you had to cover a screening test. So again, is your technology something that is mandated by the government that will help with reimbursement? Without knowing the competitive landscape, you really shouldn't proceed until you do that analysis, because that again can help dictate the direction of where you go with your technology. And again, I'll go back to additional clinical studies. You can never have enough studies. I'll just repeat that as many times as I can. You need to be able to show analytical validity, clinical validity, and clinical utility. So is the test able to do what's it's supposed to do? Does it accurately diagnose or predict the risk of a particular outcome? And from a utility perspective, does it change the outcomes? So an example here is with Oncotype DX. They published an abstract showing the effectiveness of their product, and they're able to show that to the payers and obviously get more coverage. So once you have a product, you'll need to decide who to hire internally to get started. Do you have a reimbursement director? Do you have billing, managed care, revenue cycle? Again, this is when you're getting ready to commercialize. You'll have to determine your coding strategy, as we mentioned earlier, what the end result of your innovation will lead to what code you actually use. You may not have a code for what you've developed. And in that instance, you will bill with an unlisted code. When you bill with an unlisted code, you always have to submit a explanation of what the product is with it, at least for molecular pathology. And just know that may lead to a longer turnaround time in payment. What's your list price? Again, discuss your reimbursement strategy once you have a company with everyone else involved, legal, sales, compliance, regulatory, because this really does, while people don't realize it, reimbursement really does impact every other department within your organization. So let's say, for example, with sales, if you have a sales team, you roll out and say, well, we're going to do prior authorization with every test. And the sales team is going out saying, doctor, you just order the test. Don't worry about reimbursement. We have it covered. Well, that doesn't match up. The sales team needs to understand exactly what reimbursement is doing so they can explain it to their providers when they're out in the field. The other thing that happens is, from a reimbursement perspective, when you start billing, you're going to have questions from the insurance companies asking for letter of medical necessity and additional information. You're going to go back to the ordering provider to get that information. If they're not prepared for those calls from you, they may stop ordering the test. So again, it's just extremely important that everybody understands what your approach is, what your policies are, so that you don't actually harm yourself from having tests ordered and completing when you're getting started out of the gate. And again, just to remind, FDA does not equal payment. So again, once you're ready to start billing commercially, you need to determine, are you going to bill in-house, outsource? Are you going to directly bill a health plan like Kaiser, for example? Or are you going to bill through third party? How is that billing process going to work? Are you going to have priority payers? Again, I mentioned, do you start with your Medicare Advantage plans and then try and trickle down from there? Do you start with where you're launching? Is there any contracting opportunities with PPO networks? PPO networks are secondary networks that fall underneath your Aetna's, Humana's, to say, if there's somebody outside of your Humana health plan and they have a provider that orders a test that's not in the health plan, could they be picked up by that secondary network to receive payment? That's an easy way to expand your potential for getting payment before you have medical policies in place. Again, we briefly mentioned denial management. How are you going to handle appeals? Are you going to do them? If so, which payers, to what level? Are you going to collect? Financial assistance. Marketing is really important when you're launching commercially, because will you have a dossier for your managed care team, or what simple pages can they put together to explain what your product is. Who's your payer mix? If you're mainly Medicare, as an example of that would be AlloSure, where it's a kidney test to monitor for rejection. Your road is a little bit easier than a test that is mainly Medicaid, where you have to go to each individual state Medicaid and get a provider number and get coverage. And then last item would be your medical policy approach. There's different instances of this where you want to run out of the gate, and there's some where you just want to wait and see what happens. So more detail on that in later presentations. Just restating, reimbursement impacts everyone within your organization. So here's a few examples from sales and legal and medical affairs, even customer service, because who's going to get that phone call when a patient receives a denial letter from an insurance company and they want to know, one, what the test is, because they don't even know what was ordered, two, what to do, and three, are they going to get billed? From your medical affairs perspective, will your physicians within your organization be available to help with peer-to-peer hearings to try and get this test overturned, or product overturned, whatever the situation is? Legal, I mentioned with Cologuard, it being mandated by the state, or by the government, they had a little bit easier road than some of the other products on the market. Again, this is so important. Your company may not succeed, not because it's not a great test or a great product or a great innovation, but because of reimbursement. There's been several companies who have folded because they lose their Medicare reimbursement, or they were unable to get an LCD in place. And so again, while you could have a wonderful innovation, reimbursement needs to be on the forefront of everything you do to make sure that in the back end you actually get paid, because eventually you do have to have payment for whatever it is you're developing, or else your company won't make it. The burn rate of seed money and investor money you'll eventually run out of money. And so again, reimbursement is critical to making whatever product you're working on last. And finally, this is a long battle. With CareDx and AlloMap, as I mentioned, they had commercialized in 2006. They had FDA approval in 2008. And it wasn't until they were incorporated into the guidelines where they really started making momentum with commercial payers. And when I say guidelines, the ISHLT guidelines, International Society of Heart and Lung Transplant. It took 4 years to really get momentum behind, once they launched commercially, to start getting coverage with payers. And they're still battling some of the battles that were fought in 2006. Foundation Medicine, another example, they launched a couple years ago. They're battling still to this day. Cologuard, even a test that you would think would be simple and is less expensive than colonoscopy. I think Cologuard's like $650 and colonoscopy is in the $3,000 range. It's part of the task force guidelines. It's a screening test. It's really should be covered. They still have challenges with reimbursement. And so there's multiple factors that will influence how long this process takes, from the technology to legislation to cost, volume, payer, individual coverage policies. Just know this is a long battle and you need to be prepared once you actually are commercialized. So I'm going to stop there and see if anybody has any questions.
Natalie, this is Jessica. I think this was a fantastic overview for all of our innovators. And I want to add a point to them that this is important even for those of you who don't think you'll do a startup company, because even if you're pursuing a partnership with an existing company, going in with information about reimbursement and showing that studies you have done thus far have supported reimbursement are really helpful. So I guess moving into a question for you, Natalie, is where does an early stage innovator find information about the reimbursement codes for competitors? How do you advise them to start their research along those lines?
Okay. A lot of information can be found by just researching the company online. So if you're coming up with a test to compete with Cologuard, you can find it by searching their website. You can find CPT codes through search. You can look at the Medicare fee schedule. Once you identify a CPT code to see what Medicare actually is paying for that CPT code. Medicare is great because they publish everything. And so whether it's an LCD pertaining to a certain test or the code or the reimbursement, all that's available online.
And although those spreadsheets can be intimidating at first, once you dig into them, they can be understood.
Yes. Are there any other questions?
Okay. Well, I think we will give opportunity for all of our innovators who may be watching this on a replay. You can submit questions to kinetic@louisville.edu, and we'll add that to the end here. Oh, there it is. Natalie's already got it ready for us. So you can submit those questions to our service account. We'll compile any questions and certainly connect with Natalie on those and figure out the best way to get those answers to you. So Natalie, I thank you so much for giving this talk for us today. I think you've given us a good overview of reimbursement and where even to start on a topic that is so foreign to a lot of folks until you've actually been there in the trenches. It's really difficult to understand. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
All right, talk soon.